Okay. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ev Fedorenko today. So Dr. Fedorenko is faculty at MIT Masters Institute of Technology. She got her PhD from MIT as well. And I was fortunate enough to get to know her when I started my grad training, and she started up her postdoc at MIT. And I could pretty much always count on running into Ev in the scanner whenever I went, because she was always collecting data. So like hundreds of participants. And I think she's going to talk about some of that today. And it paid off because, she was very well funded. She received the prestigious K99 award. She became faculty at Harvard Medical School at Mass General Hospital. And then she moved back to MIT, where she's currently an associate professor, the Frederick A. and Carol J. Middleton Career Development Associate Professor of Neuroscience. And since then, she went to receive quite a few more awards, very prestigious awards and grants. And she still continues to publish at a super astonishing rate. She's sitting at an HNX of 37. So, and one of my fondest memories of Ev is when we were at a speaker dinner, and we're all, having a fun debate about, I forget what it was exactly, but she quickly whips out her laptop, in the middle of this fancy restaurant, and she pulls out data to support her argument right then and there. And I actually, I think that happened not just once, but a few times. And she's thoughtful and fierce, and she's not afraid to challenge traditional theories and use novel methods in neuroimaging. And she's also just a wonderful person, friend, collaborator, and I'm very lucky to know her. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fedorenko.
Thanks so much, Zainab. That was so nice. I have no memory of doing that, but I totally believe that I did at the dinner thing. That sounds plausible. All right, so it sounds, from what I understand, you guys come from pretty diverse backgrounds. And so just to bring us on the same page with respect to language, I sometimes say that language can be kind of thought of as a shortcut for telepathy, because we can use it to effectively transmit thoughts across minds. And in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to use some sequences of words to get some ideas from my head into yours. And to do this, the way this normally works is we draw on some set of stored language knowledge. Some set of stored language knowledge to convert our abstract thoughts into utterances. And the nature and kind of linguistic knowledge we have is still fiercely debated in the field. But at some level, somehow we have a bunch of sounds that we know, a bunch of words that we know, and a bunch of rules for how sounds can combine to create words and for how words can combine to create phrases and sentences. And once we have prepared an utterance in our head, we can send it down to our motor system and either speak it like I'm doing right now, or if we're literate, we can also write it out or type it, or if we're a speaker of a sign language, we can sign it. On your side, you're basically flipping the process around. So you're decoding my utterances, and it starts from perception, either auditory perception, as in this case, or again, you could be reading or seeing somebody who is using sign language. Zainab has done some of the best work on the visual perception aspect of language processing. And then at some point we get to a level where we've extracted linguistic utterance representation. And then finally we try to decode thoughts from that. And communicative success occurs when the rough content of my mind is somewhat similar to yours. And there's of course exceptions, like sometimes we may try to deceive other people. I won't try to do that today, but so typically we're trying to kind of align and get the same rough representation. And each of these perceptual components, like the speech perception, visual, word recognition, articulation, or hand motor control, they're all separate from what I sometimes call higher level aspects of language. And there's whole subfields studying each of these components. And we've done a little bit of work on articulation, a little bit on speech perception, but the bulk of the stuff that I've worked on over the last decade has been on language comprehension. So this is at the level where we're past the perceptual stage. We've extracted the set of words, and then we're trying to interpret them to try to understand what somebody is trying to convey to us. And so I'll outline the program my group is pursuing just in a few minutes, and then I'll tell you about a few discoveries we've made over the last few years. So like I said, the big question most of the time so far has been spent in my group, actually in the field of language in general, on language comprehension. So how do we infer thoughts from others' utterances? And getting, ultimately, of course, we want to understand the actual computations that take place in neurons, the actual algorithms that are implemented there. Getting to that level of description in domains like language is challenging because we don't have abundant cellular physiology data. We can't precisely lesion different parts of the system to examine the effects and so on and so forth. But we're making some progress, and I actually, time permitting, at the very end, I wanna very briefly mention a recent line of leverages in silico models, so deep learning models of language that have recently gotten really, really good. And I think that maybe actually will bring us a step closer to understanding the actual computations that may be going on to solve language. In the last couple of years, we started tackling language production because it's a much harder thing to study, but it's about half of what we do when we use language. So it seems also important to understand. Presumably language production draws on the same set of knowledge representations, as I mentioned, but how exactly we go from thoughts to utterances remains not very well understood. And so there's some early exciting things that we're figuring out. And people often talk about comprehension and production as really just kind of the mirror sides of each other. But if you think about it, the computational problems that we're solving in comprehension and production are actually quite distinct. And there are some pretty big differences in that, for example, in comprehension, we often work with very noisy input, either due to general literal noise in the environment or because people make errors, we speak in incomplete sentences and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of reconstruction that has to happen. And there's now a lot of evidence that we actually are incredibly efficient at getting information from these noisy signals. But in production, to effectively communicate, we have to articulate a very precise sequence of words in just the right order, timed just right. And we're trying to get a comprehender as close to the relevant part of the meaning space as possible. Whereas in comprehension, it seems like kind of rough approximation often is fine for many intents and purposes. So it's a very different kind of a problem you're solving. It's kind of, a postdoc in my lab once came up with an analogy of pattern completion for comprehension versus pattern separation, which are notions from the memory literature. And I think there's something really deep about that way of thinking about it. And I think there's a lot more to discover. Another big line of work that's been kind of growing over the years is trying to understand how language fits within social cognition. So a historically dominant view of language is a little bit crazy in that it has rejected the notion that language has evolved and primarily exists for communication. And to somebody who has not worked on language, it just seems like, what? Like, what's the alternative, right? And so the alternative view that, like I said, has been quite prominent is that language has evolved and primarily exists for complex thought. And all of the kind of social communicative stuff just kind of, it's like a little nice maybe side effect that happened. There is now abundant evidence suggesting that communicative pressures optimizing language to transfer information efficiently across people has been a huge driving force in shaping language and making it have the form that it does at the level of the lexicon, at the level of grammars we have, at the level of sounds we have. So at this point, it's kind of just not tenable to deny the importance of communicative pressures in shaping language, but understanding how language fits within this broader set of social and communicative abilities we have, like interpreting eye gaze, facial expressions, body language, people's tones of voice, and so on and so forth, as well as how to utilize our mentalizing ability, being able to understand what somebody else may be thinking in the service of interpreting linguistic signals, leaves still a lot of questions to tackle. And there is a recent study, just first ever study of fMRI study of communication in macaques. And strikingly, the set of regions that you get when in a macaque brain when they observe socially relevant behaviors is just strikingly resembling the system that I've been studying for a while and that many other labs have been studying, which is the language system. And that just can't be accidental. Like, so seeing when this paper came out and I saw this picture, like I had like, you know, kind of shivers down the spine moment, because, you know, I think there's something really fundamentally deeply linking more basic social cognition and the kind of symbolic communication that humans have. And we're now trying to get evolutionary questions, of course, are notoriously difficult to tackle. We're trying to get at them maybe through the lens of development, although I'm still trying to figure out if I'm patient enough to work with kids. But we're trying to see whether we maybe can discover some broad organizing principles of the frontal and temporal cortex that may have eluded us, because typically these different aspects of social cognition and communication have been studied by distinct fields. So there's people who study face perception, there's people who study voice recognition, there's people who study emotions, there's a whole field studying language. But without putting all of that together, it may be sometimes difficult to see some generalizations emerge that may tell us something really important about how language fits into this broader arsenal of cognitive tools we have. Another biggie is meanings. So of course we know a lot about the world, and there's a lot of questions of how that knowledge of the world translates into the linguistic forms that we store and use to communicate. But there's also just a lot of big questions about the organization of semantic knowledge, like what is the dimensionality of that space, how abstract versus tied to sensory and motor experiences our concept representations are. And again, I think some of the artificial neural network models that have been becoming really sophisticated in the last few years can tell us something pretty important about potential boundaries between abstract conceptual representations and linguistic forms. And then a few strands of work have to do with reorganization and recovery after damage. And so I often like to contrast this brain, which is the brain of an individual who experienced a massive left hemisphere stroke at the age of 60, early 60s. And this person has what's known as global aphasia. So you guys may have heard of things like Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia. So this is kind of the worst kind of aphasia there is, which is basically you can't understand anything, you can't produce anything. There's occasionally very residual single word comprehension, but the person is basically incredibly linguistically impaired. And I'll talk about this population in a couple of slides as well. And now this is a person, whoops, this is a brain of a person who is missing her left temporal lobe, also a massive, massive missing chunk of the brain. But she didn't know that she had her left temporal lobe missing until she was about 20. And she went for a routine EEG study, and there were no signals being picked up in the left hemisphere. And then she was advised to get an MRI. And so this is a case of most likely perinatal stroke. So it's stroke that happens as you're going through birth canal or right after. And there's now, again, quite ample evidence that this kind of early damage just doesn't leave much of a trace in terms of our cognitive abilities, which is a big kind of service to the redundancy that we have in our brains. And so there's different cool questions that you can ask in cases of these late versus early damage. Like in early damage, we're trying to understand where does the language system go when it can't go where it would normally go, and how does the brain deal with the necessary crowding that may occur, given that, for example, in case of the language system migrating to the right hemisphere, which is what typically happens when you have extensive early left hemisphere damage, it now has to potentially cohabit the same territory that more social functions exhibit in a typical brain. And so how those functions may start sharing cortex in such cases is potentially important to understand for how these abilities relate to each other. And in the case of late damage, we're mostly right now focusing on trying to understand whether a set of very domain general circuits, which we have and which have been linked to fluid intelligence and our general reasoning abilities, whether they may help in cases of domain specific damage. So damage can affect all sorts of domain specific abilities like visual abilities or linguistic abilities or social abilities and whatnot. And given the flexibility of that system that we use for kind of solving novel problems and so on, there's this emergent hypothesis just in the last few years that that circuitry can potentially help recover function either by assuming that new functionality because it's very flexible and can adapt to kind of new task demands, or by providing alternative solutions to whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve, like language comprehension. And then the final direction is really trying to understand how people differ from each other. So we differ in many ways, including linguistically, which is what we focus on here. There is many ways in which you can be better and worse at language. We've done some work on hyperpolyglots. So these are individuals who have, learned 20, 30 languages. And we found, for example, that their language system is much smaller than in typical individuals, suggesting that there's some greater efficiency, perhaps, we're hypothesizing. But we're also just looking at the typical population and trying to understand what is it that makes some people have quite bilateral language representations and others really left lateralized. Some people have very interconnected language systems and others less so. And all of these features are highly stable within people over time, suggesting that there is signal there is meaningful variability. And we're trying to relate it to behavioral variability, how good you are at doing language, whatever that means, and genetic variability in collaboration with Simon Fisher, who is the geneticist credited with the discovery of the FOXP2 gene, which has been termed the language gene, which is not right. It's just a gene that is linked to some cognitive ability, some aspects of brain development, and there's a handful of others. So we're trying to see whether common variants in those genes that have been linked to some aspects of brain development and cognition may explain some of the variability that we see. And we use a whole bunch of tools. I've started out for the first bunch of years mostly doing fMRI work, but in the last several years, we're increasingly relying more and more on intracranial recording data because in studying dynamic systems like language, is just really useful to have time course information of how things unfold, how representations may change as new information is coming in. So we're supplementing fMRI stuff with intracranial recordings and MEG, as well as a growing popular tool. And then neural networks and recent work, but I probably won't get to talk about that today. Okay, so when I use the term the language network, I'm referring to a set of left lateralized regions on the lateral, frontal, and temporal surfaces that support language processing beyond low-level perceptual processes. And you can find these regions very easily. You basically contrast responses to language with some perceptually matched control condition, which can be something like reading or listening to sentences versus pseudo words like non-words like flip and block it or whatever, or listening to speech in your language versus speech in a totally unfamiliar language. Any of these contrasts robustly gives you a set of regions that have very similar stable topography across people, but also quite variable in the details of where exactly these regions land. And because of that, I've spent some time arguing for the importance of performing all the critical analysis using an approach where you define these regions in each individual brain before you tackle some critical question about how these regions work, as opposed to the traditional approach where you average brains together in a common space where you lose a lot of information and sometimes draw fundamentally flawed conclusions. And so we've generalized this basic topography to a whole bunch of languages. So now to over 40 languages with a paper hopefully forthcoming soon. So this is across 11 language families. The basic architecture and the basic properties of the system seem quite stable, which is important to show because a lot of work in cognitive neuroscience has been on English, and people make broad claims about how language works, and English is actually a pretty weird language in terms of its properties relative to the 7,000 languages that are spoken across the world. And it so happens that it's kind of a dominant language in academia, but it doesn't mean that it's in some cases superior in telling us about human cognition. And so this kind of generalization is important and very under performed. A few key properties of the system, I already mentioned this. So these regions respond during both comprehension and production, although, as I alluded to, there may be some additional machinery that is just used for production, but not comprehension. It's a very functionally integrated system, meaning you can tell a lot about the activity in one region from the activity of another region. And there's many methods to look at that. And across different methods, you find this, that these regions are functionally really quite similar. They reliably track linguistic stimuli. I won't dwell on this now, I'll come back to this a little bit later. And they're causally important for language in that if you have damage to them in adulthood, you have language problems. So bad things happen when you lose some parts of the system. Okay, so in the remaining half hour or so, I'll tell you 3 questions that we've asked over the last bunch of years and the answers we got. So first, I'll ask whether these regions that support language processing are specialized for processing linguistic input. And the reason that this question is important is because specificity or overlap, for that matter, is one key clue to the kind of computations that a region may support. So it kind of delineates the part of the hypothetical space for what this region could be doing so that it responds to stimuli A, B, and C, but not D. Then I'll probe a core distinction within language between syntax, or the structure of sentences, and word meanings to test whether different parts of this network respond to these 2 aspects of language. And then I'll ask whether, what is kind of the key driver of the response in these regions? Again, contrasting these 2 kind of alternatives. Is it about building these complex abstract hierarchical structures or building complex meanings? Okay, so language is evolutionary, very late emerging. And so it's actually quite sensible that it would make use of existing machinery. It's also quite a sophisticated ability that we have. And so on the other hand, you can also say, well, maybe it's plausible that we would have developed some circuits that would support language and maybe some other human specific things like math and music. And those hypotheses also have been put forward. I was drawn to the field by this question, to the field of cognitive neuroscience, because fMRI is the very best tool we have to ask that question. There are behavioral ways to address this question, but they're indirect and limited in various ways. But if you want to know, okay, the regions we have that are active when we process language, are they also working hard when we're doing math, when we're watching others' complex hierarchically planned series of actions, when we engage in general working memory demands, when we think about others' minds and so on? It's the best tool we have to probe whether these different functions may overlap. Okay, and so when I came into the field, which was, I guess, around like 2008 to cognitive neuroscience, there were claims about overlap between language and everything. Like when I was starting to give talks on this topic, I would say, I challenge you to come up with a function for which I can't find a paper that will argue that language overlaps with that function somehow. A lot of the claims focused on what's referred to as Broca's area. I often use it in scare quotes because it's not really a meaningful term. It's just a big chunk of the frontal cortex. Like, it's functionally not meaningful. There's a lot of different things going on there. Anyway, so one of the first things that we've done was to find the language regions in a bunch of people, establish that they care a lot about language, and then ask, how do these regions respond during these diverse kinds of tasks? And so here's a sample profile of a region in the posterior temporal cortex. Here this is percent bold signal change, so how active a brain region is during these different tasks. So this is response during sentences. This is a non-word sequence task. This is done with splitting data in half, so there's no non-independence problems here. And in different colors here are responses to when people are solving math problems, when they're holding information in working memory, listening to different kinds of music, observing others' actions or gestures, and thinking about others' thoughts. And you find this highly selective response profile. And I should say that, of course, all of these tasks produce very robust responses elsewhere in the brain. So it's not like they're bad tasks or anything, but it so happens that these regions that work so hard when we process language, they just don't seem to be active much during these other tasks. And this is a region in and around Broca's area, and it shows similar kinds of selectivity. And so this is, this holds true across the whole language system. A complementary approach comes from this population that I alluded to of individuals with global aphasia. It's a very interesting population, and it was ignored by language researchers for many years because the reasoning was, well, your whole language system is gone, so you can't, what can you learn about language if like everything is destroyed, right? There's no language left. But these people actually provide one of the best ways to answer this centuries old deep question of what can you do without language? At least once your brain has matured and exists in the state of an adult, and you take the language system away, can you still think, right? Can thought exist without language? And so Rosemary Varley is a friend and colleague who has been studying this population for the last bunch of years, and she's worked with a handful of these. These patients are rare, so oftentimes damage of the sites will either lead to death or total incapacitation, leading to kind of very cognitively impaired people. But in a handful of cases, you get this very extensive damage to the language system. But yet, when she talks about them, she says it's very clear that the light is still on, so they can't understand what you're saying, but you can see that they're trying as best as they can to extract some information from their environment very actively. And anecdotally, a lot of them continue to do things like play chess and solve Sudoku puzzles. So that already was a clue to her that it's not like all of thinking ability is gone. And over very careful and challenging studies, because as you can imagine, even explaining simple instructions can be quite difficult, she's established that these patients basically can do everything except for language, which I at the time was finding incredibly striking, because I came into the field with a prior that language and thought are much more intertwined. And it really seems that language is just one code that we have for sharing meanings across, and a lot of complex thought can proceed just fine, even if we don't have this ability to translate a thought into an utterance that a conspecific can understand. There's another deep question that this work doesn't address, which is whether language is critical in getting some of these abilities into place. And of course, answers to that question are very hard to obtain because we can't deprive kids of language. There's a handful of kids who come from these horrible circumstances of abuse where they're not spoken to and treated badly, and oftentimes people try to make inferences based on those cases. That's really hard because so many things are affected when you're abused at that level, and so it's challenging. But one population that is providing some clues are deaf kids born to hearing parents. So occasionally, and that happens, I mean, it's not unheard of, it's not very common, but occasionally a typical hearing family, both parents are hearing, will have a deaf child. And in the US, things and medicine and education are good enough these days so that these kids don't get misdiagnosed anymore. Like, they get diagnosed as deaf very early on, and there's a lot of education pushing for exposure to sign language from early on. But in many countries where things are not as developed, these kids often get diagnosed as mentally retarded for many years. And so oftentimes they will grow up in these families. They're loved and snuggled and all that, so they're not like in any kind of similar form of abuse like those wild children cases. But they don't get linguistic input. They just, because they can hear. And so they provide this really unique window onto how is their cognition developing in the same or different way from that of kids who get typical linguistic input. And at least one finding that emerged quite robustly so far is that they seem to be slower in developing a full-blown theory of mind. So this ability to think about what somebody else is thinking or believing or desiring seems to go a little bit hand in hand with language developmentally. So there are intriguing hints. I think there is more work to be done there. But what this work that I talked about here tells us is that once everything is in place, the presence of the language system is definitely not critical for complex thought. So it seems like the system that we have in the adult brain is quite selective for language. And this selectivity places important constraints on, again, what kind of computations can be carried out by these regions. So the fact that these regions do not respond to arithmetic or music rules out this hypothesis that is still quite popular. I've been trying to kill it for a while and it just won't die, that we have this machinery for abstract hierarchical structure building. And maybe there is some bits of the brain that do that, but the bits of the brain that care about language are not that. So to the extent that we think that there is some abstract hierarchical structure building areas, they're not the ones that deal with language. And the ones that do deal with language, and of course have to represent the hierarchical structure of language, they couldn't care less about hierarchical structure and any other kind of stimulus. Okay, so now on to the next question of the relationship between structure and meaning in language. So that's a big question that's been long debated. We can take any simple sentence, a simple sentence from a corpus of English. So somebody actually wrote this, I think it's from a book or something. And there's a bunch of words when we hear or read a sentence. And so we access the meanings of the words. And then somehow we also figure out which words go together and form kind of meaningful larger units, right? Like, for example, we have a sense, even if we never taken a syntax class or whatever, we have a sense that picked up the car keys is kind of a meaningful chunk, but something like coat and picked up is not, right? It's kind of a part of a string that doesn't cohere into a structure. And this divide between thinking about word meanings and the processing of structure has been prominent in language research for many years. And if you look at the kind of leading proposals of the neural architecture of language, every one of them postulates a region that does syntax. There will be a little circle that they'll put somewhere in the brain and it will say syntax or something to that effect. You know, the sophistication level of theorizing may differ, but everybody separates some part of it, that part of the language system that just does syntax. But there's also a long history of questioning this divide. And that comes from a few different directions. So in linguistic theorizing, for many, many years now, people have been observing that simple rules based on abstract syntactic categories, like, okay, you take a noun and a verb and you make a sentence out of them, that just doesn't get you very far. And the most common example case of this is verbs, right? So to shiver, to comfort, and to put are all verbs. But to shiver, you can just say, I shivered, and that's a perfectly fine, well-formed meaning. But you can't say, I comforted. It just doesn't mean anything. You need a patient of the action who is being comforted. And you can't say, I put a book. You have to specify a location. So that's kind of the textbook case of verb-specific or word-specific constraints on combinatorics. And pretty much all linguistic frameworks these days incorporate knowledge of individual words as part of the knowledge of the grammar. There is another line of evidence that came out of computational linguistics. So when people started building parsers, so basically you take a text, a bunch of words, right, a bunch of sentences, and you try to assign interpretation. And to do that, you have to kind of figure out the structure of each sentence. That was happening, I don't know, 60s, 70s, 80s. It became apparent very quickly that any kind of parser that's just built on these abstract rules, like a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and a verb phrase is made up of a verb and, you know, another object potentially, that just doesn't work. You have to put in constraints that are specific to particular words. And then behaviorally, a lot of evidence emerged suggesting that people are incredibly sensitive to contingencies between particular words and the structures that they occur in, and our abilities that have to do with understanding and use of words are very strongly related with our ability to structure things above and beyond kind of general shared variance due to fluid intelligence or something like that. And so in line with this kind of strong integration that has emerged from linguistic theorizing and behavioral evidence, I have been questioning the separation between word meanings and syntax. And there's basically two parts to this argument. One is that combinatorial processing, most relevantly here is syntactic structure building, seems to be distributed across the language network as opposed to focally represented in one part of it. And any region that seems to be sensitive to something to do with structure building is at least as sensitive to meanings of individual words. Now, I'll just briefly expand on each of these for a couple minutes. So, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of proposals out there about the neural infrastructure of language, and each of them postulates a separable syntax selective component, so a component that does syntax but doesn't do other things like understanding individual word meanings. But interestingly, where this component emerges differs across proposals, which already should be a red flag, meaning some people put it in the left inferior frontal cortex, other people put it in posterior temporal cortex, other people put it in anterior temporal cortex. So all of these, and some people say, okay, maybe it's in a couple different places. So all of this should already give you a warning flag, like that can't all be right. And the fact that no consistency emerges across methods and across approaches is worrisome. And so the kinds of paradigms that have been used to probe sensitivity to syntax are many, but one common manipulation that has been used across dozens of studies is the manipulations of syntactic complexity, where you can operationalize it in terms of the presence of non-local dependencies. So when words connect to each other locally, it's easier to process sentences compared to when sentences contain a non-local dependency. Just to give you an example, so here are two sentences that have used the same words. The senator that attacked the reporter was tall, right? And here the words in bold have these local connections, but a sentence like the senator that the reporter attacked was tall, it's much harder to process, very easy to measure behaviorally. And the claim is that this is because when you get to attacked, you have to retrieve this senator, one of the nouns, from memory, and it's a non-local connection. And people like Angela Federici and many others have argued that this kind of a contrast, the contrast between these sentences with non-local dependencies compared to local ones, leads to activity in and around Broca's area. And you'll notice how this little inset here is covering the posterior temporal cortex, where you also often see a bit there, but a lot of people still focus on frontal regions because they find them more interesting, more sexy. I honestly don't understand why. I think because there was some early claims that some parts of Broca's area may have emerged in humans de novo and are not present in any equivalent form in other primate species. And that early stuff may have led to the notion that all of the kind of cool human specific stuff will happen in the frontal cortex. Anyway, there's a lot of obsession with frontal regions. But anyway, so the point is that if you use an approach that has sufficient power, and you find language responsive regions in each individual person, and you ask, okay, which of these regions are sensitive to this kind of structural complexity manipulation, you find that all of them are. You can definitely replicate the sensitivity in the inferior frontal and posterior temporal cortex, but any region you look shows that effect. So it's definitely not a focally represented phenomenon. And then the second part of this is that, and this is work that we've done over the last few years, is any region that cares about structure also cares about meaning. There's many ways in which we've now shown this. You can use stimuli that vary the presence of syntactic versus lexical information. So this, again, this is one of the things that I did as one of the first studies in grad school and postdoc years, where again, I came in with a prior to find this dissociation. I was raised as an undergrad, my early training was in a tradition where syntax was very separated from word meanings. And so I was fully expecting that, okay, well, we now found a bunch of these regions that care about language. Some of them surely will care more about structure and others about meaning. So I spent 2 years trying to analyze a bunch of data where I just kept not finding that dissociation. And that was very upsetting at the time because I was trying to get a result. And turns out I was getting a result. It was just a different kind of result. Anyway, so the way that we and many other labs have done this is by basically taking different aspects of information from the signal. So in normal sentences, again, this is just a sentence from a corpus, you have both meanings of words and you have structure for putting them together. You can just take a bunch of words that don't connect with anything. So all individual words are interpretable, but they don't connect into a phrase or a sentence. Or you can take a sentence and replace each real word with a thing that sounds like a word, but is not. So this sounds like talk when you sometimes go to talks and they have a lot of jargon in them and you understand that the sentences that the person is saying, but you have no idea what's going on. I hope this has not been your experience today. I try to avoid jargon at all costs, but that's kind of what those stimuli are like. So there's some structure, but can't quite make sense of it. And then there's a scrambled version of this, which has neither. And if there were a dissociation between sensitivity to structure versus lexical meanings, word meanings, you would expect to find some regions that look like this, where they show strong responses whenever there are real words that are interpretable and weaker responses to the conditions that don't. And other region that shows stronger responses to structured stimuli like sentences in these Jabberwocky, so-called Jabberwocky sentences from Lewis Carroll, who has a poem made up of these, compared to unstructured things like lists of words and lists of non-words. And everywhere you look in the language system, you find this, which is these two main effects where effectively the profile is the strongest responses to sentences, the lowest to non-word lists, and the intermediate response to conditions that have either word meanings or structure. This is not a problem with resolution. This is not a problem with using a temporally not sensitive method. Oh, this is just showing actual data from a few regions. This is from I've now replicated this effect, I think, across 5 different versions of an fMRI study. This is showing from 2 sample data sets. Every now and then you'll see slight differences in how the 2 middle conditions land, but that pattern of 2 main effects is statistically always very robust. And you also find it in an intracranial data, except that you pretty consistently find this bias towards stronger responses to word lists than Jabberwocky. But the overall pattern is still the same. So descriptively, it kind of looks like the more language-like the signal is, the better the response. The more bits or the bigger chunks of the signal you can map onto existing representation, that's one way to think about it, the stronger the response. And I'll come back to this in just a couple of slides. And then there's many, many other paradigms that we've now looked at. So you can tax the processing of structure, the processing of meaning by, for example, using violations, right? So you give people a context, and then the critical final word can violate the structural expectation, like have a lack of agreement in, tense or gender in languages that mark gender, or it can make no sense given the context. You can use adaptation, so repeated aspects of information lead to a reduction in responses. So you can give people a sentence and then a sentence that's either using the same structure or the same words, but a different structure. And there's a handful of these kinds of paradigms that all target word meanings versus structure in different ways. And the bottom line is that, again, anywhere you look, even at the level of individual voxels or unconnected voxel sets within this broad, language network, seems to show sensitivity to both of these things. Like you cannot find even single voxels and single subjects that systematically prefer, are more sensitive to syntactic violations. So after years of trying to find this dissociation, I basically conceded that it just doesn't seem like those two things are separated. There's nothing that cares about abstract syntax. It's all very tied to word meanings. And this, like I said, aligns quite well with a lot of current theorizing in linguistics, with a lot of behavioral data. So in the end, it all makes sense. It just took a while for me to kind of get there and convince myself that it's not there. I mean, we haven't fully given up. We're now looking for this dissociation in single cells. So with a neurosurgeon at MGH, we're collecting single cell recordings from humans while they perform some of these kinds of manipulations. So that's kind of as high spatial resolution as you can get. So far, not seeing a dissociation. We're trying some laminar imaging with some folks at MGH to see whether different layers in the language cortex may show some biases towards structure versus meaning. No data from that yet, but for now, I'm tentatively concluding and arguing that the brain regions that care about word meanings are the very same regions that support the processing of structure. All right. So in the last just, I guess, 5 minutes or so, I'll tell you one other thing briefly. So the sentence seems to be, or sentences seem to be the preferred stimulus of the language regions, much like faces are the preferred stimulus of the fusiform face area, and spatial layouts are the preferred stimulus of scene selective areas. But why do sentences produce this strong response? When we looked at this paradigm that I talked to you about, the sentences, word lists, Jabberwocky sentences, and non-word lists, we found that in sentences, but not in Jabberwocky sentences, these kind of jargony things, you find this gradual increase, kind of monotonous increase as you go across a sentence. So this is just word position within the sentence. And this is already suggestive that something is happening in sentences, but not in these structured stimuli that don't have meaning. I don't know, I had my worries about Jabberwocky stimuli. They're artificial stimuli, and maybe it's just people just get bored or whatever. So I wanted to try to look at this question a little bit more. And so the question is it about structure building or is it about meaning construction? So there's reasons to think that things have to do with meaning. So many features of language, as I briefly mentioned, including its syntactic properties, have been shown to be shaped by communicative pressures. So I think language is basically the sufficient vehicle for thought. So you would expect a system that's designed to exchange thoughts would be more focused on meaning as opposed to structure. But there's also a growing body of work that, again, I briefly mentioned, that people are really, really good in dealing with syntactic errors as long as there is enough plausible meaning there to recover. So we're basically willing to forego all sorts of syntactic misshapedness of language as long as we can figure out what the meaning was. And so in this kind of series of studies, we try to test this idea that maybe as long as you have evidence for local semantic composition, that's sufficient to kind of drive the system to the max. Like, let's say the sentence level of response is our ceiling, right? That's the best thing that this sentence, we haven't found any other stimulus other than sentences that that system prefers more. So going from that ceiling, let's see if we can get there with stimuli that have locally semantically combinable things, but potentially destroyed structure. And to do this, so how do you estimate local semantic combinability? Well, again, intuitively, it's very easy to come up with examples like if you hear eat an apple in close proximity, it's probably not accidental and you'll probably try to connect them. And if you see same eat in restaurant, right, there's some connection there likely. If you get eat an accordion, maybe less so. And you can formalize this with this notion of pointwise mutual information. So that's an information theoretic term which measures dependence between variables, in this case words. And it's basically how likely are two words to occur in the same context, controlling for the independent frequency of each word. And so here's what we did. So we tried to destroy sentence structure by permuting word order while preserving this local combinability. So we introduced local word swaps, and we've done it multiple times. So this is just a single word swap where you just take a random pair of words and swap them, and then you can do this, a few times. And then we created a continuum of these scramblings from intact all the way to very scrambled with 7 swaps. But in color here, I indicated a color continuum. And so you can see that even in a sentence where there's a whole bunch of swaps that have been performed, the words in any given window are still quite similar in color, suggesting that they still were in proximity to each other in the original stimulus. And indeed, if we measure local mutual information over windows of about 5 or 6 words, kind of as you move through the stimulus, it remains high in spite of the syntax being degraded. So you can present these strings to people, and there are very sensitive behavioral. They say, of course, this is not a sentence anymore. This is like much worse than the typical good sentence, and there's this continuum that you get. But this local mutual information remains high. And when we looked at the responses to these stimuli in the brain, we find that they track this high local mutual information. So the response to this highly scrambled stimulus, this thing, their last on, they overwhelmed, word, day, farewell by messages and gifts, is as high as it is to an intact sentence. This is very weird. When I first saw this result, I was certain something was wrong. And so then we've replicated this 4 times now. This is a real effect. We've also replicated this in a language in Russian, which is a language where morphology is very rich. So we removed all sorts of structural morphological cues in addition to scrambling word order. And the results are also similar there. Now, locality is important. I'm just skipping ahead here a little bit. So if you take the same sentence and you scramble things in a way that locally you no longer have this semantic coherence, if you wish, the response drops to the level of unconnected word lists. So that shows you that you kind of need these words that go together in close proximity to each other to do this. And again, this is with visual presentation word by word. I haven't said that, sorry about that. We're now doing this with auditory presentation to see if it generalizes. It should based on everything else. But anyway, so yeah, I already said that. So sorry, I kind of breezed through that one a little bit. We can talk about this a little more. This was one of the kind of most surprising things, results that we've discovered. And the way that I presented it is not how it was. It was actually designed with a different question in mind. I'm just like telling you a story here, so it's a little bit easier to process. But it was initially was just a surprising finding, kind of accidental finding. And then and it kind of sat on the back burner for a while. And then as these comprehension theories of language within this noisy channel framework where people cope with a lot of signal corruption have become more and more prominent, I realized that that's actually a really important result. And it tells you that, I think it tells you that really what that system tracks and or computes the most is semantic connections between words and building complex meanings. And whatever structural stuff it may care about, it's all in the service of doing that. So yeah, so here are basically the key things I've told you about. So the regions that support language are highly selective for language over other things. It doesn't seem like there is spatial separation between regions that support structure building as opposed to representation of word meanings. And the main driver of this system seems to be something like semantic composition, where local words are combined into complex meaning representations. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I can tell you more about other things in the question period. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Wonderful talk. So I want to open the floor for questions, and I encourage students to ask questions first.
So I have a question. This is very cool talk. And so about the third point, so I wonder if it's because the language region responds to the local semantic composition, or it is actually we reconstruct the whole meaning of the sentence implicitly, like we process, like in the words, if we shuffle the order of the word within a word, we can still reconstruct the word because the holistic processing of the word. So I wonder if in that case, in those like 7 or 5 swaps case, we actually reconstruct the whole meaning, even though the stimuli is a fragment.
It's a good question. So a very good question. We thought about that. So one, we should know that there are regions. So, okay. So one thing to say here is that it's clear that to the extent that there is reconstruction like that going on, the language system does not carry that cost, right? Because otherwise we should see an opposite kind of a pattern with stronger responses to cases that need more reconstruction. We see that signature in a different system that cares about general effort. So that's one thing to note. If you behaviorally present these stimuli to people and ask them to reconstruct sentences, they mostly can't, or at least they can't much more so for the more scrambled conditions. So they actually often will give up and they say, no, it seems like they'll reconstruct some partial phrases, and maybe that's enough. And I think kind of that's the key thing there is I think constructing local bits of meaning is enough to drive the system to the max. I don't think you need full-blown kind of very complex meanings. And in fact, we have ongoing work which is trying to determine the integration window of the language regions, like how far back does context influence the processing of the current input. And it seems like that window is around 6 words. Again, words is probably not the right unit, it's probably bits, and words is kind of a very language specific, like specific language specific notion, like how information is packaged into words is different across languages. So it's most likely something that is in information units, but it's really quite striking how local it is. And of course, we know that we can integrate information over longer time windows, but I think what likely happens is that once we get to a level of around 6 or so words, which I think often corresponds to event level descriptions, I think we transform that linguistic representations into a more abstract format, and then all other stuff happens downstream in more kind of abstract conceptual areas. And the language stuff is just really does this very dumb local building of relations. Well, I don't want to say dumb. I mean, I say dumb because, again, I came into this field thinking that language is very deeply tied to thought. It now is very clear that it's really not. Like, it's a cool thing we have in that we can share our complex thoughts with others. And it may be really important developmentally. That's, like I said, I don't say anything about development, but in terms of a mature system, it's just not doing any thinking for us anymore. It's just doing this translation between little chunks of meaning and forms, linguistic forms.
That's great. So in the chat, James asked, how do these findings translate for people who are bilingual or multilingual?
Good question. So from what we know, people who are bilingual use the very same system. And in fact, people who are multilingual, like up to, 4, 5, 20 languages. I mean, we haven't tested people in 20 languages. We've tested people who speak 20 languages, but we haven't tested their processing in all of those languages. But to the extent that people have some knowledge of the language, it seems like it's all happening in that core system. Now, it's a little bit puzzling because we don't get confused. When we speak multiple languages, we don't get confused all the time. And we know that using multivariate analysis, we can very reliably distinguish among languages, but there's still a lot of puzzles about how exactly that's implemented. In part, one puzzle that bugs me about this complete overlap among languages within the language system is the set of findings where there is a very deep emotional connection with your native language that just doesn't hold for your later acquired languages. And that manifests in many different ways, like sex-related words and taboo words are just processed very differently. Therapy works in your native language much more efficiently than in second languages. So there's got to be some differential links between the first native acquired language and some emotional circuits, like, whatever, in the amygdala or wherever they may be. And I just don't understand how that can be instantiated if it's all overlapping circuits for representing linguistic forms across languages. So there's puzzles like that, but empirically, what seems to be the case, it's all within that same system. It's differentiated at the level of fine-grained voxel patterns. But beyond that, yeah, I don't really know if you have specific questions. I mean, there's claims about how that also might affect the executive system. I think most of that evidence is very mixed and not super compelling, in that, like, we don't see many serious changes in the executive function systems of bilinguals compared to monolinguals.
This was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much for this. I wonder if you have, following up on James's question, if you have any interest in code switching speakers, if it really is the case that it's about semantic composition and not about the structure building, you might expect the very same results in sentences which have, for example, English and Spanish mixed or English and Russian mixed.
Indeed.
You should see the very same responses.
Indeed, that would be cool to do. Yeah, you should do that, or someone should do that. Or write to me and see if we can do something together. I mean, I'm right now, the stuff I didn't talk about today at all is we're starting to try to link neural representations during language processing to state-of-the-art language models, artificial neural network language models, and they're doing really, really well at capturing this activity. And so now a lot of the work in the lab was shifting towards trying to understand what makes a good model of language processing. And one trend that emerges is that across models, so we've compared like over 40 models. I don't know if I have this slide here in the backup slides. I mean, this is going to be a lot of information here. Just focus on this one panel here. So this is a bunch of models. On the x-axis is the model's ability to predict the next word, which is a standard normative task used for assessing model performance. So you give a model a little bit of context and you say what's the next word, and then you can use the actual text to test the whether if it does well or not. And these are all kind of over 40 models, and they vary a lot in how well they can do that. And on the y-axis is how well these models fit human data. And this holds across multiple data sets. There's a very strong relationship. So models that seem to be good at predictive processing are the ones that better capture human neural data and behavioral data in our and other work. So one potentially very important generalization is that models, be they biological models in neurons or in silico models that are optimized for predictive processing, predicting local upcoming elements, may be what's kind of needed to solve language, to deal with extracting meaning from linguistic input. And we're trying to take that apart more and understand this better. But anyway, so because we're shifting so heavily towards that, a lot of other lines of work are being downgraded a little, not downgraded, but just not backburnered. But it's a cool question. Somebody should definitely do that. That would be cool.
And I've got a question for you too. I gotta
Yeah.
head soon, so but great talk. I'm really curious about in your third conclusion here, because you said these were visually presented sentences, right? So I'm curious how you think presenting them auditorily would fare, because with visual, hypothetically, since you have the entire sentence that you can visually process at once, you might be able to kind of interpret or group things together.
Yeah, so to clarify, it's not presented once, it's presented one word at a time. So it's kind of mimicking auditory presentation. So you still don't, but I think,
yeah, because with auditory, you're only getting your temporal ability to process it is a lot different.
That's right. I suspect that what will happen in the auditory stuff, and we'll know more soon, is that the window will maybe be a little bit narrower, because our phonological trace of the previous input is just very, very fragile. I think the visual representations are a little more robust, allowing potentially for longer things, but
yeah. Interesting. Thanks.
I've got a question. This might be a little bit off topic, but when you were talking about the parents with hearing that have kids that are deaf and special situations like that, have you ever heard of any research, or have you ever been curious about language comprehension, the effects of split brain surgery in people that have epilepsy and the severing of the corpus callosum, and whether there might be effects in the long term other than simply not having sensory input from the other hemisphere?
Good question. Don't know that literature super well. No, it's a cool question. I mean, the closest we've come to that question is through this case study of a patient that I mentioned. I mean, she's not a patient, she's a human who didn't know that she's missing her left temporal lobe. So she's a fully functional person. There's like no deficit as far as we can tell behaviorally. But in her, we asked the following question. So I was interested in, given that she was missing her left temporal lobe, I was curious of whether there would be any language function in the left frontal cortex, right? Because that's a perfectly functional left frontal cortex. We can show that a lot of executive stuff is happening there, like it would typically, and there's just nothing. there's zilch language activity in the left frontal cortex, which to me suggests that the internal within hemispheric loops are critical for wiring up the frontal language circuits, and whatever cross hemispheric connections exist are not good enough or not, cannot do that. Because so she has a, I should say, she has a fully functional, perfectly normal looking system in her right hemisphere. So why are the right frontal language circuits not wiring the homologous things in the left hemisphere? I don't know. So there may be some clues as to how within versus cross hemispheric connections are important earlier on. But in terms of like how things are affected, I think the evidence is pretty scant that there's any like serious downstream effects on language, short of these like perceptual effects that you mentioned. But
yeah, because behaviorally you can hardly ever tell the difference.
Exactly, yeah.
But yeah, I'm just curious, like in terms of like comprehension. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, yeah. Sorry, wish I knew more.
Oh no! It was a super niche, and it's because I come from more of a epilepsy side, so it's it's just something I've always been curious about in terms of language. Yeah.
Great.
And then, so Dan has a question. It seems like most of the fMRI results you presented are based on GLM analyses and classic subtraction logic. What kind of evidence for language selective brain regions is there from analyses like functional connectivity?
Very strong. So that's a good question. I'm sorry, yeah, I didn't present this here, and I don't think I have these slides here, but that's one of the first. Okay, so there's two kind of sides to this question. One is, what are we picking out with our univariate contrast, like sentences versus non-words? And it turns out now that across fields, very well established localizers, meaning tasks that target a coherent subset of our cognitive abilities that elicit stable responses within individuals over time, and that generalize across things that they should generalize, like in our cases, modality of presentation, language for different people, and so on and so forth, pick out the very same networks, which are picked out from natural correlation data, voxel-wise, data-driven structure discovery kind of approaches. So the best work there in that realm was done recently, just came out in Journal of Neurophysiology by Rod Braga, who I think is now starting in Chicago this year. So former mentee of Randy Buckner, where they've scanned people over many, many sessions, which you need to get these fine grain networks in individual subjects. And the network they recover maps incredibly beautifully onto the language, onto the network that they find with the univariate contrast that my lab has been using. That's really reassuring. And I mean, we've seen this a little bit in our data, but we haven't done this super systematically. And I'm hoping that with Zainab, we can look at this using connectivity patterns as well, like white matter connections, to predict the precise locations of these language regions. So that system that I'm talking about, it is a natural kind. It is there regardless of which method you go at it. We just use our subtraction method because it's a quick and dirty way to pull that relevant functional subset so we can study it. And moreover, if you look at the functional correlations among the regions of this network versus correlations between the language regions and pretty much any other system in the brain, you again find very, very robust associations, and you find this across many different kinds of stimuli. So even when people are processing really complex stimuli, which may be argued and have been argued by some to engage the kind of domain general executive circuitry, you find zero correlation on average between what language regions are doing in terms of their up and down patterns versus any other system. So it seems like all the different approaches that you can try, they recapitulate each other, which is great. When there's convergence, it's nice. When there's differences, it's harder.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions, if there are any.
I can ask one. So yeah, it was really cool to see your stuff, especially the recent stuff. And I was really intrigued by the that last experiment you showed with the systematically changing, swapping out certain words. And so, speaking of the univariate, univariate, you're showing that it's a consistent level of activity for all of those swaps. Do you see any difference in like MVPA or decoding? Can you tell the difference? Or, if you look at the fully complete sentences versus, you know, as you move along with the switches, does it look like when they are processing those switches, they're representing it in the same way as the full one, or could it be like an increase in effort to try to figure it out?
That's a good question. I mean, so again, the stuff that we've collected so far, we've only analyzed at the level of conditions, and given the variability among strings within a condition, I worry about, you know, how much you can infer from that. But from what we've looked at, the condition that has a single swap is very robustly distinguishable from both the intact and the more scrambled versions. Multiple more scrambled versions are not distinguishable from each other. But that's again at the level of conditions. We're now trying to tease this apart by doing very systematic, like single trial level response, where we vary both the distance, the strength of semantic connections within these stimuli to try to better characterize like what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for that system to reach that maximal level of response. And of course, ideally, we want to run those stimuli eventually in intracranial data to also see the time course. Like, for example, I mentioned there's this buildup effect that we see in sentences. Given this result, I would expect to find similar buildups for scrambled stimuli, but how exactly that dynamic unfolds is an interesting question. What we've seen so far is actually that if you give people unconnected lists of words, you find this initial rise and then it goes down. And so it all kind of fits very well into the generally very Bayesian, very rational kind of a framework. Like if I'm throwing garbage at you and you're like, okay, there's just nothing, there's no signal here, right? It's just all kind of disconnected little bits and pieces of information. But if you're starting to see likely non-accidental things appearing together, you're starting to put them together. But it's certainly not the case that we, like people will say things like, oh, we can always make sense of anything. That's what humans are good for. And sure, maybe given enough time out of a random set of words, you can construct something. But the fact that the responses to unconnected word lists are so low tell you that we're actually very rational in this way. We process the words and we can test people's memory for that. We process them, but whatever the language system does when they process sentence stimuli doesn't do the same thing when it gets random lists of words. So in terms of how exactly those stimuli are represented, yeah, I'd very much like to know. I mean, we have some hints so far, but yeah, I mean, this relates to the first question, right? Like, to the extent that we build only these very local kind of phrase level meanings, do they end up with exactly the same representation, even if the initial stuff comes in scrambled? Like, and is it ordered at all? Is it like a totally unordered connected graph? Like I think it'd be really cool to try to figure this out. And maybe the neural net models of language can also help give some hints there.
Okay. I have one small question that maybe you and I can talk about in greater depth later. But
yeah, sure.
So you were mentioning that you're about to explore some of the especially the last bit in auditory processing in the auditory domain. But I'm kind of curious about your take on how you think the developments of the language system plays in with the development of literacy and the acquisition of reading.
Yeah. It's a very hard question. I mean, the way that I think about this language system in adults, I would not expect that cortex to show selectivity early on. In fact, in light of the social stuff I mentioned, one hypothesis that I'm hoping we or somebody else will test at some point is that initially the whole lateral, frontal, and temporal cortex is just attuned to socially relevant signals. That's what babies need to do to survive. And then as we get more and more exposure to the whole richness of communication and social interaction, we see this fractionation into regions that now start specializing for voice processing, other regions that specialize for facial expressions, others for body gesture, and a subset that ends up storing symbolic representations that is, the language knowledge. It's right now it's a speculation. A couple of different groups have arrived at that general notion independently, so that suggests that maybe there's something on the right track there. But it would be very useful to track the development of the selectivity as kids grow up. But of course, as you know, it's very challenging to scan kids right at the edge when at the time when the explosion of language happens, like around 1 or between 1 and 2 or something like that. So that's tricky. And how literacy comes in to that, I don't know, I think you know more about that than like anyone in the world probably, but I mean, at some level we just learn another mapping, right? And like somehow we figure out that sounds relate to visual representations. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have much more to say about that. I really like the study from March Livingstone's group from like 2015, where they train monkeys on number words. And there's a few interesting findings there, but they basically train them to associate numbers of juice drops with symbolic representations like 3, you know, and it took them, I don't know, 2 years to train them. But once they did, you start seeing selective responses to the learned but not learned digits, which I think is effectively very similar to learning words. So that suggests that that mechanism for associating some aspect of the world with some symbolic representation is quite conserved across species. And there is, yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. There's a few other interesting like strands that recently emerged, including work that I'm sure you've seen from Jim DiCarlo and Stan DeHane, showing the reuse of like existing ventral circuitry for learning effectively reading in monkeys, or some regularities in the visual symbolic strings. Anyway.
Very cool. Wonderful. Thank you so much again. And if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to email her.
Thank you. No, seriously, please feel free to email me. I'm pretty good with email. I don't respond as fast as I used to when I was younger, but I will respond to all emails, especially
super fast anyway. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Ev. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, guys. It was really fun. Thanks for being engaged, audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you all. See you guys.